Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is our first Balanced Living lecture of the 2018 calendar year. I am the chair of the Health and Wellbeing Committee, and this is probably the fourth year that we've done the lecture series.
Nobody's listening.
We also do articles in the Bar Report magazine, and we are this year starting a new series where quarterly we have someone come to our monthly meetings, which is the first Wednesday of every month, to discuss stress in their particular area of the profession. So this year on February 7th, we have Magistrate Flores from the Domestic Relations Court, Ross Flores. She will be with us for a while at our regular monthly meeting to discuss Domestic Relations Court and how they deal with stress, their employees' stress, as well as practitioners, the stress that they are under. She also wrote an article last year for the Cincinnati Bar Report. We do have articles that appear in there every month, so if you want to check out her article, you'll see that she has her own way of dealing with stress. On May 2nd, the second in that series will be a speaker from YLS named Liz Stegman, who will talk about balancing life and law as a young lawyer. She actually teaches yoga, and that should be interesting. We have also scheduled our second Balanced Living lecture for the year for May 11th, How to Change a Bad Habit. It's an executive coach named Jeff Raker. He spoke a few years ago. There's a video. All of our past lectures are on YouTube, and his video is on YouTube. He had a very interesting talk the last time about how to gauge your communication based on people's personality types. So I think people found that very interesting. Today's topic, though, is very timely and something we're all looking forward to. Bob Buechner and I had the pleasure of having a long talk with our speaker on the phone to develop this topic: managing stress to optimize performance, creating more joy in your life and work. And our speaker today is Dr. Smitson, who is the executive director of the Central Clinic and on the staff, or is a professor of psychiatry, correct?
Yes.
At UC Medical School. And finally, just want to remind everyone that these lectures are sponsored by the Cincinnati Bar Foundation, and this committee has a specific fund at the Bar Foundation named for Ken Jameson. You can see his plaque out back. If you're thinking or interested in contributing to the Bar Foundation, we would ask that you always include his name on your check so that those funds can be earmarked for this program. Thank you.
Okay, hi everybody. I want to thank Coach Buechner for arranging this. And I want everybody to know my wife Tricia is here. Hold your hand up. And if I don't cover everything on the program, we'll cover that in the Q&A. So I want to start with what the research shows that gives people joy. And it's very interesting if you look at the research, and I discovered that Harvard University has been studying this topic of joy for 80 years. And I came up with 3 building blocks for what creates happiness within a given person, none of which will be a great surprise to you. The first building block is the quality of people's relationships. Very interesting one. People who have that building block for happiness or joy are ones that have somebody they can confide in, somebody they can call and say, let's have lunch or breakfast, let's go for a walk. Now, we know that women are so much better at that than men. They're great social networkers, and they're always getting together and talking about their kids and their husbands and whatever else women talk about. And studies, however, on men, and one of the studies I ran across looked at men who have spent years, say, playing racquetball or tennis together, and they looked at how much sharing of personal information those men did. And the answer was very, very little. One example was 2 guys who played tennis together every week for 5 years, walked off the court one day, and one says to the other, how's your wife Cindy doing? And the response was, we divorced 3 months ago. So that had never been shared, and so men are more likely to not have that as a building block. The other building block for joy or happiness is health. Again, not a big surprise. If you know anybody or if you yourself have chronic pain, chronic health problems, it saps your joy and makes happiness very difficult to achieve. And if you don't yourself have that, if you know somebody, as I do, several somebodies who have chronic back pain, for example, it's just a huge downer for them and their spirit and their psyche. Now the last one, and this is going to be a blow to all the men, as it was a blow to me. The third building block of happiness is not sex. It is, however, money. And so money is deemed much more important for internal happiness than sex. But the interesting thing about the research on money is that, and they looked at both blue-collar and white-collar men and women on this issue of money. There is a close correlation between increasing happiness and joy with increasing annual income. Now, the interesting thing is that that peaks at $75,000 a year. So at $75,000, the correlation begins to diminish, so that if when you get 75, you peaked with your happiness. If you get up to 100,000, there's a little bit more happiness, but not much. Now, that's not true in my household. There's way more happiness if we're up toward the top limit of that. Now, what are some of the clinical issues of stress, anxiety, and of course depression is in there, but we won't be addressing depression today. That's a whole topic of its own. There's both generalized anxiety and specific anxiety. Generalized is, of course, the person is ongoing, has anxieties about everything. Now, we need to understand the difference between fear and anxiety. Would anybody like to take a shot at that? What is the difference, clinical difference between fear and anxiety? Does anybody know? Pardon? Okay. Well, you're close. Anxiety is anticipatory. We often talk about anticipatory anxiety. And the example is if a person's standing on the sidewalk getting ready to cross the street, is standing there gripped with fear that somebody may run a red light and kill me, that is anxiety, because there's nothing in reality that would drive that feeling of anxiety. If, however, the person's in the middle of the crosswalk and a car's running the red light and about to kill you, that's real fear. That's based on the reality of the moment. Panic is something that can occur from ongoing anxiety, and I've had people that even get to the point they cannot leave their homes because they're so gripped with anxiety. Then we have the psychosocial or psychosomatic issues of stress and anxiety. What does that mean? Well, I have patients that come to me and they're very upset because their medical doctor said, it's all in your head. They don't know what that means, and what it really means is that the physician has not been able through any tests to determine why the person's having headaches, let's say. Now, the headaches are just as real for that person as if there was a physical cause. And so once we get past trying to calm the person down about it's all in your head, we begin to look at a number of things. We look, of course, try to understand, is there something driving that person's anxiety? And we look, and this may surprise you, at diet, because diet certainly can contribute to a person being unsettled, being anxious, and caffeine is one that we look at. We look at, Is the person following a balanced diet? We even look at how much food dye, a person may be ingesting. In fact, I just learned from a physician who talked on this topic recently that there's only one kind of pickle that does not have a food dye. But to get that pickle, you have to read the labels, of course. So we look at food dyes, we look at what's driving that stress, and we look at how well the person may or may not be taking care of himself or herself. Now, 50%, talking about the prevalence of anxiety, 50% of all students across the country list anxiety as one of their major concerns. 41% of all workforces around the country list anxiety. Now, when we look at more specifically what drives anxiety, the huge, huge number one is the unknown. Huge driver. The person who's had a polyp removed, waiting the 5 days or whatever to get the word on that. Is that cancer or not? The person who is a cancer survivor, who has had a checkup, and 45-year-old man who has beaten cancer 2 years clean, coming up on a checkup, had a panic attack the night before. A friend I know who had eye cancer 20 years ago, has a yearly checkup, has been clean for 20 years, but has enormous anxiety as he approaches that new scan to see if he's still clean. So the unknown is huge, and the unknown goes to many, many different parts of our lives. Sometimes the unknown has to do with what's happening to our relationships or to our jobs or whatever. Abandonment is another devastating driver of anxiety. That's everything, and by the way, infants all the way up to 100-year-olds and beyond experience anxiety. So it is a part of our lives that we never get rid of it. It's always there. But abandonment is a huge driver. I've had a few cases over the years where a husband leaves home. This always happened with the husband leaving home for his workday, only to arrive at night and discover that his wife had a truck ready to back up when he left the driveway. She's taken half the furniture and gone, and he had no idea that marriage was in trouble. So that kind of abandonment. The other abandonment we know well that's going on today is when children are abandoned by their parents. And that can be the parents are on heroin, the child has to go to foster care. I've often thought what it must be like to be 4, 5, 6 years old. The social worker arrives in your home and says to your mom, "Pack his bag, he's going with me." Now, that child usually does not know that's coming. Child gets in the car with the social worker, goes to the foster home. Because he or she is on a busy schedule, maybe waits 30 minutes, and that child is now in the home of strangers. So having been abandoned by his or her parents. So huge, huge driver of stress and anxiety. Now, for our purpose here, let me give you one driver of anxiety, and that is people who have gone through accidents. I saw one woman who survived the plane crash here some years ago, TWA, 13 survivors. I saw her for 3 years. She finally got to the point that she could get back in an airplane, but had enormous anxiety even hearing planes go overhead. Even though she, after 3 years, was able to fly again, she never got over the anxiety if she was out and it was raining, because it was raining the night of the crash, and she was thrown outside the plane. Her husband sitting beside her was killed. People who are molested have enormous anxiety. In the mid-90s, a number of women around the country started speaking out about the damaging effects of being molested as little girls. Up until then, I don't think my industry took it as seriously as we should have. As we began to get stories about, as we took histories of the mom saying, well, Uncle Joe used to go in and tickle Susie a lot before she got out of bed, we now understand more fully what Uncle Joe was doing. So the anxiety from that, women who spoke out those years ago said that they never really get over the anger and anxiety and depression of being molested as little girls. So those are experiences that drive the anxiety, and we think about, okay, and there's performance anxiety. We all know about that one. Everything from a basketball player to sexual performance to job performance and on and on. Now you say, what can be done to push back against the anxiety that people feel? Well, one is to build self-confidence, that you can handle whatever you're stressed about. And a good example of that is that Adolph Rupp, the famous basketball coach at the University of Kentucky, in his book, he talks about when he was getting his team ready for the game, if they were sitting there biting their fingernails, he knew they were going to have a good game. But if they were sitting there and being too relaxed, he feared that they were going to lose that night. So anxiety is important. We get energy from it, and yet people with the disorder, that they're not managing it, often feel out of control. They may have social anxiety, so they start avoiding crowds. They may have unreal expectations of themselves. And one of the interesting things of people with an anxiety disorder is they feel love is performance-based. Now, they may have been raised that way. There are parents who their love is conditional. They love you if you behave well, and they don't love you if you don't. And they don't make that distinction of disapproving of your behavior versus disapproving of you as a child. What about medications? 65% of all North Americans are on prescribed medications, 65%. 43% of those are on mood-altering medications, which is enormous, and obviously gives you an idea of how much mood-altering medications our society takes. Self-medication, we all know about that. That has to do with drugs, heroin, carfentanil, alcohol, various things. Even smoking is a form of self-medication that calms people, and is so hard for them to stop. 50% of all traffic deaths are related to alcohol, and around 40% of all hospitalizations are now related to alcohol and drugs. So the system is continuously overwhelmed. Physicians, of course, feel that they cannot win. You will recall that about 8 years ago, the FDA chastised physicians, saying that they were not giving people enough medicine to deal with the pain. So now, of course, physicians are being chastised because they're giving too much, and fully 50% of all drug addicts today started out with prescription drugs. And I don't know about you, but if you've had any minor surgeries, you usually leave with a bag full of Oxycontin to control your pain. Now, what are the positives about anxiety? One, certainly, as I mentioned, is energy and motivation. It is brain stimulation. Anxiety stimulates our brain. Our brain loves that. I know a 100-year-old woman who is cognitively very clear. She is what we call a worrywart. and she worries constantly, but I'm convinced that at 100, her brain is in very good shape, her memory is good, because she worries so much. So we get a lot of benefits out of worrying. In terms of negative, we also know things like blood pressure goes up, headaches, sleep problems, and so on. Now, there's 3 ways that all of us deal with stress and anxiety. I'm going to name 2, and I'm going to ask you to see if you can name the third. One way, and there's only 3 ways that we all express everything. One is verbal. We all know that one very well. Some people discharge their stress by yelling, screaming, whatever. The second one is behavior. We know that one very well. That includes everything, including road rage, people who behave in negative ways when they are stressed out, and they write it off, well, I'm having a bad day, or my mood's bad, or whatever. Now, what do you think is the third and only way? Yes?
Nervous stomach or headache.
Internalizing. You're absolutely right. The internalizers, and I hope in our Q&A that some of you will say, which of those modes do you use? Because people tend to use all 3 of them. It's which one is your major outlet is the important thing in terms of your health and certainly in your joy. Let's see. We looked at diet. We looked at this physician that I just heard recently made an interesting statement. She said, "The whiter your bread, the sooner you die." So, the other thing about diet that I want to mention is the great role of magnesium. Magnesium has been found to have a calming effect on people with anxiety. So if a person is having generalized anxiety during the day, they're told to take their magnesium in the morning. If they're not having generalized anxiety, but they just want to rest better, they're told to take it in the evenings. Now, I want to tell you something that will, if you remember nothing else, I hope you remember this. The brain, for this purpose, is put into 2 categories, 2 functions. One is the emotional function of the brain. You have to always keep in mind that that part of the brain, that while it gives us joy, it is completely irrational. It is completely based on self-indulgence. It's based on the easy way, not necessarily based on the right way. Now, the other piece, which is so related to how we all raised our children, is the CEO part of the brain, sometimes called executive function. That is the frontal lobe of the brain. Again, we as parents act as the CEO with our children. We help them know what they can do and what they cannot do, and we correct them constantly. Now, what's hoped for is that as we move into adulthood, we incorporate that CEO function into our own brains. Now, the frontal lobe, in terms of the CEO part, is not fully developed in men until they reach 24 years of age. Women are about 22 when it happens. Now, that, and brain scans have helped us understand that. That allows us to understand now why teenagers make such stupid mistakes. They're not playing with a full hand. And that's why a smart teenager will allow himself or herself to be mentored. And I'm always telling teenagers, find a mentor. You cannot fly by your own. And it's great if your parents are doing that and if you listen to them, but if you don't want to listen to them, find a mentor to guide you until you can guide yourself. And the teenagers that do that tend to do very, very well. They stay in school longer, they wind up earning more in their careers, and so on. To build a CEO, you have to have some tools. And so when we begin to look at tools, and I'm going to give you some case examples on that. One tool is to, and since some of you are still eating, I won't ask you to do this, is to close your eyes, put your palms up, hold your palms up, and say, I will deal with life as it comes to me. I will deal with life as it comes to me. That can be a very calming exercise for people that have ongoing anxiety. As you know, AA has always had the mantra, one day at a time. And we've all heard live in the moment. And again, I cannot overstress that. Otherwise, you're getting into anticipatory anxiety. Two cases. One was a woman who had gotten to a point that she was just petrified to fly, had not necessarily had a traumatic experience, it just developed enormous anxiety. Happened to be a couple that Trish and I were friends with. So they called one weekend and wanted to come over on a Sunday, and the wife wanted me to fix her so she could fly. So Trish and the woman's husband took a walk for about an hour and came back, and she was fixed. And so to demonstrate that, again, she hadn't flown for years, the four of us decided to book a trip to New Orleans to see if, in fact, she was fixed. So we all got on the plane, and they were quite wealthy and booked themselves in first class, and Trish and I were in the back of the plane. So before the plane takes off, the husband comes walking back and says, my wife says she'll be more comfortable if her therapist rides next to her. So I got a first class seat to and from New Orleans. And in fact, she did very well. And since that day has been flying continually whenever she needs to. Now, what did I tell her? What was the fix? I said to her, close your eyes. Tell me the time in your entire life that you felt the safest. She thought for a couple of minutes, and she said, it was when I was in my grandfather's lap. I felt totally safe, that nothing could happen to me. So I said, okay, this becomes your point of reference. I said, and this woman is very good at focusing. I said, you focus on that anytime your anxiety meter is going up, you go to your granddad's lap. She was able to do that, and it worked for her, and she could feel her anxiety dropping every time she had those images, and to this day still uses that. The other example, not too long ago, a businessman came to me, got my name from somebody else, and had built his own company, enormously successful, had 1,000 employees, suddenly developed anxiety about getting up in front of the employees. So he came, and I worked with him. I saw him only 2 times. And for him, I said, I want you to focus only on your content. You do not focus on who's in the audience. You focus only on what you want to say, and you say that with confidence. And so I said to him, though, my phone is always on, so you can call me. So again, after the second visit, he started getting back up in front of his employees, but on 2 occasions, he would say to them, let's take a 10-minute break, and he would go out and call me. And I would reinforce the formula for him, and he would refocus and go back in and finish the meeting. So that's been 6 months ago, and I haven't heard from him since, and I think his company's doing just great. So those are examples of tools, And those are the kind of tools that we give people to work with. Now, certainly, those tools don't work for everyone. Some people need ongoing psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy. That often is trauma-based therapy. These days, we're less interested in what a person's experience was with the mom and dad. We certainly touch on that, but what we want to know, what traumas in your life are unresolved? Because those are the traumas that are causing you trouble. Those are causing you anxiety. Those are hurting your productivity. You're not able to be all that you can be in the workplace if you have things that are unresolved. So that certainly is the example of a person that does need ongoing help and counseling. And we feel that that's an excellent evidence-based intervention, which means, I'm sure you all know what evidence-based is, that there's been a control group that did not get that intervention matched up with a group that did get the intervention. So with that, I'm going to stop and hear about how you're dealing with your own stresses and what you want to share and questions you want to ask me. So let's stop there. Yes. Bob, go ahead.
I appreciate your comments, especially on anxiety. If there's one thing that I learned in the military that stuck with me, and probably it's only one thing, is let anxiety work for you.
Yes.
If you're anxious about giving a speech, make sure you are well prepared and rehearsed it and delivered and practice it, with your...
That's the confidence building.
I always appreciate that. I think that was, as public speaking for me was always a point of anxiety until I went up teaching in law school. And law students.
Well, yes. The other imaging I get people on public speaking to do is to image that you're saying it to your spouse or to your best friend. And again, you are able to close out. Now, men typically are much better at compartmentalizing. That's why wives come and say to me, well, I left him at home with the kids, and I got home, and the house was a wreck. Well, he was watching a football game, and he compartmentalized that and was oblivious to the kids. So men are good at compartmentalizing. You get them up in front of a crowd and you say, I want you to compartmentalize, only think about your spouse and you're talking to her or to him, and that'll help your anxiety.
Okay, now I've got an interesting question. It has to do with ACE, which has to do with the environmental factors of kids up to the age of 5. We're just finding out the tremendous impact that has on them. And there's some suggestion that we can go in and alter the DNA of these 5-year-olds to basically try to do something about that. That to me is a remarkable discussion. I know about CRISPR and cancer and all that, but altering someone's DNA to change where they are psychologically, to me, I mean, do you believe that?
Oh, I believe that, absolutely. I believe that we're on the brink of a lot of things like that. I'm sure all of you have heard about the new cancer treatment where they extract our immune cells and inject them with a cancer-fighting product that goes in and literally hunts the cancer cells down and kills them. Because cancer cells, as we all know, hide themselves from our immune system. And so that's why immune systems are not effective with cancer. But yes, I think all those things, I think medical science is at a very, very exciting place right now. Who else? Yes?
For people who do internalize, and I think maybe a lot of lawyers do, because they, to their clients, have to appear in control, problem solvers. It is, I'm assuming that's problematic because that thing's never resolved. Do you have any special advice on how to change habits that are ingrained?
Well, first of all, habits are so hard to change. We all know that. And we know that our behaviors, studies have shown, are about 90% habits. And so one thing is like to treat it like any bad habit that you have. And how do you begin to change it? You begin to move it from what I call automatic response to manual control. It's like going from an automatic transmission in a car to manual control where you're shifting. Now, what are the stages of change in something like you're talking about? The first stage of change is that the person becomes aware, okay, what is driving me to feel stressed and so on, and to cause me to internalize. And then the next stage is that before you face that situation, whatever it is, you know that you want to handle it differently. Now at that point, you're still not handling it differently. You're still behaving in the same way, but you know you should be. The third stage of change is that you are in the situation that produces anxiety, and now you find yourself, because you've kind of pre-programmed yourself for that interaction, if that's what it is, to behave differently during the transaction itself. And then the final stage of change is that you have a new behavior, a new response to whatever was causing the stress, and now you internalize that. But those are the stages to go through, and you have to be patient with yourself, because none of that happens in a straight line. I have people that get very angry and saying, I knew I shouldn't have responded that way to my spouse, but we say, okay, let's go back and check on what's the plan, how are you going to deal with it, and they finally get there in most cases. Others? Yes?
What is the relationship or the difference between stress and anxiety?
Well, they're pretty much one and the same. The stress, of course, can be something like a job that's really tough to pull off. How much anxiety you feel about that is a different issue. You may feel, I don't know if I'm qualified to do this, but I'm going to try my best, and I'm going to check with whoever I need to make sure I'm doing it well. Those are all managing yourself through stressful situations that tend to overwhelm you. But if you begin fantasizing about, I'm going to fail, my boss is going to kill me, that's anxiety, because that hasn't happened, and you can't let yourself go there. Instead, your mind begins to say, we can do this. That's where your CEO comes in. Again, just like reassuring the child. Your CEO is saying to your emotional self, we can do this. We can learn how to do this. We know who to go ask to help us do this, and we can do a good job. That helps as much to your internal self as it does when we're doing it to a child. Now, at the same time, if our adult CEO is not operating well, what happens? The same thing that happens when a little child feels that mom or dad are not in control. Mom or dad can't make me safe. Mom and dad don't know what they're doing. That child feels enormous fear and anxiety. So your internal self feels the same way. If your CEO acts like it doesn't know what it's doing, doesn't know where to go and ask, then the internal self, the emotional self, is going to ramp up the anxiety from that. You had a question?
I did. I'm not sure how to pose it. I don't know if you talked much about the effect of exercise.
Oh, I should have, yes.
But I have a family member, and I've seen this happen over and over, and I do think certain strains of anxiety can run down through family members.
Absolutely.
But it's almost like they will engage and deliberately push so that something, a relationship explodes because they need to let off this horrible anxiety stress.
Right.
And then once they go berserk,
Right.
and it's all,
Right.
it's a
Right.
big hullabaloo.
Right.
Then all of a sudden, you can see it. They're calmer.
Yes.
They're sorry.
Yes.
They're this, they're that. But it's sad. And
Yes.
It's
Well, they're not doing the homework they need to do to identify that stressor and begin to manage it differently and get their CEO on the job. Sometimes I say to a person, your CEO was nowhere to be found. You're describing something to me, and obviously you had no guidance from your frontal lobe. Let's get the CEO out of bed, get him or her on the job, and help your emotional self. Now, the other thing is, you're maybe alluding to it, what is a person's startle response? I have a high startle response. If I'm watching a game or reading a book and Trish slams a door, I jump out of my skin. That's a startle response. And we know veterans have huge startle responses, the ones that have been in combat, of course. But that's one way to gauge your internal self in terms of dealing with anxious situations or tough situations. But I cannot overstress, as I started a few minutes ago when I talked about the CEO of the self, you continually are strengthening that. You strengthen it by reading, by learning, by talking to people that can help you strengthen that. And so, and I can't overstress how I've seen that happen with women, for example, who have husbands that tend to be mean and unkind, not hitting them, but just mean. When they learn how to deal with that, they learn how to say, "What's your problem?" And you know, it's not my problem. You're not going to make me feel bad because it's not my problem. And they begin to push back out of confidence and out of the feeling they're in control. And their emotional self then begins to gain confidence that I got a CEO on board here that is now starting to stand up and be counted. Yes?
Is anxiety inherent in being human because we can imagine, or is it a learned behavior because we've been exposed to certain things and we respond to them?
Yeah, it's a good question. Certainly, it's inherent in being human. It's a part of the human condition. It can then have added layers to it from genetics or from traumas in life and failures in life, but it's inherent. There's no question about it. It's in our DNA. But how we manage it, and that's what I'm saying about all these things, how you manage it. And it is possible to manage it no matter how much anxiety you have. Now, clearly, if you have a real fear situation, like you're terminal, of course, that's not anxiety, that's real fear. And so the 100-year-old woman I was talking about earlier will say, "Tonight's the night." For a while, I didn't know what she meant about that, but what she's saying is, "Tonight I might die." So anxiety, again, that's anticipatory. I have a patient, I think about 45 years old, that is obsessed with streaks in the sky that airplanes often leave. He is convinced that those are toxic chemicals that are bad for all of us, and he will have me, he said, "Now come to the window, I want you to see the streaks." And yeah, the streaks are up there. But I say to him, "I don't know. I can't tell you that they're toxic or not toxic," but he obsesses about those streaks in the sky. So those are the more extreme levels of anxiety, but nonetheless, this guy has not been able to leave his home. He's gotten more and more anxious over time. Yes?
Do you have any advice for dealing with someone who externalizes their anxiety, who screams and yells? Because in this country, I think you see a lot of people do that more than internalize.
Well,
some of it's internalized, but there's a lot of
yes.
it too.
You know, I think one thing we all have to do for each other is to help each other. So I think anytime we see somebody doing that, to be able to say, "Could I give you some advice?" Now, they might say no, and so you can't go any further. But talking to them about, have you ever thought of a different way, you say to them, of expressing what's frustrating you? And if you can get them just to talk about it. Now, the other thing is interesting, again, research has borne this out at all ages, including kids. It's called the mirror effect. We don't do it enough with each other, saying, "You know, you really seem very upset today. It looks like you're having a really tough day. Do you want to have a cup of coffee? Talk about it." Now, because we mistakenly think that all of us see ourselves. We don't. We are pretty oblivious to how we come across. And so if you have somebody that cares enough, or if you care enough about somebody, to mirror back to them. Now, the research on kids doing that has been pretty impressive, that you say to a child, "You sounds like you're really mad at your sister, you're acting mad toward her, and let's talk about that." That definitely alters that child's behavior toward his sister. So talk to the person, look for openings. I think that everybody gives windows into what their issues are in life. Now, we may decide not to try to raise that window to ask them about it, or we may try to raise the window. And you don't have to do it immediately. You can say, oh, by the way, yesterday you mentioned that things are not going so well for you. Do you want to talk about that? Because the person has given that window. And I think most people walk around in life hoping that somebody will understand them, somebody will care, somebody will ask them, especially if they're giving windows to people and nobody is caring. And I had a buddy some years ago that did just a lark of a survey. He asked 20 people on the street, how are you doing? And they all said okay, and he said to them, I plan to die today. And I think 18 of the 20 said, oh, that's good, and walked on. So we don't listen. So I say we got to be better toward helping people around us, and you can get good at it. You'd be surprised the influence you can have on people if you just comment on what's going on. I'm concerned about you. It's clear you're not, you must be losing sleep, or what's going on. Yeah, Bob.
As a follow-up question, Walter, I coached high school basketball for 15 out of the last 16 years with 3 different coaches. And in every case, their response to bad play is absolutely yelling at the top of their lungs.
Yeah.
Really berating the player.
Yeah.
Maybe there's some role for me to play in terms of interacting with that, but I think I would do so at risk of life. And did something at the wrong time.
Yeah.
My question is, what is the likely response of an athlete who's yelled at by a coach?
Well, it's never going to be good. I think that coach is doing that for himself or herself, not for the athlete. I think that if we see ourselves as mentors and coaches, and I think we say to the athlete, clearly there's something going on with you. You're not hitting the stride you need to hit or the performance you need to, and I'm going to talk to you in person about it. Now, of course, one of the things that is interesting, and I've written about, is unsolicited advice. It's pretty worthless unless the receiver has made some commitment that they value our advice. And most of the time, people don't even take the advice they pay for. So we know they're not going to take the advice they don't pay for. So I caution people not to waste their wisdom unless you have some commitment. Now, going back to your example, if that player has committed to learning from the coach, and how many coaches there are, that should be the coach's signal then that it's a teaching moment. It's not a moment to yell, that every issue of that nature presents a teaching moment, particularly if, as I said, the student and the teacher have some commitment that I'm here to teach you, I have the wisdom and the experience. So if you have that upfront commitment, those interactions obviously go much, much better. Yes?
I'm a younger attorney in the area of family law, and one thing that I've experienced, and I'm a few years in, is this feeling of vicarious stress, because I'm in an area where, in my opinion, from what I've seen, it's the highest of emotional stakes. So you're talking about family, health, safety, because there's custody of children involved, other parental rights issues, there's civil protection orders with domestic violence. About 95% of my clients are domestic violence survivors. Right. And what I've experienced in my law office and organization is where they pretty much tell you, well, it's not your kid, so don't worry about it so much, that kind of thing. And I think that works to a degree, but I still experience when I get home and I'm decompressing this vicarious stress. So could you talk a little bit how to address that?
So are you saying that you haven't found a way to impact on them, their behavior, or is that what you're...
Well, no, I mean, it's something where, we have a very high success rate in those family law cases. And I mean, I had 2 full hearings this morning, and both were successful. But a lot of times in family law, already I'm experiencing, it doesn't even feel like a win. And your clients, although they might be relieved, aren't happy.
Yes.
From the meaning that we understand happy.
Yes, yes.
And so I just know from a well-being standpoint that I'm working on managing that stress.
Yes. Well, it's a good question. One of the things that in my training that we were taught very early is that you cannot take on the stresses of the people you're working with, and otherwise you'll burn out and not make it very far. So I think having those boundaries, those emotional boundaries, are very, very important. And I often get people to think about each person as a circle, and what's going on in that circle and the path that that person's on in life is unique to that person. If the person invites us to come into the circle, then the question is, how can we be helpful, or what is the goal in that circle? But I think also I would suggest in some of the cases you're talking about that you try to get them to agree to some kind of counseling that might help them move. You've apparently dealt with the legal issues, but as you're saying, the happiness is not there, the joy is not there. And for you to be able to identify that for them in a caring way and say, there are organizations that have experts to help you with that, and they'll see you as a family or individually. It may make you feel better that you've handed them off to somebody else who can add that component that, as you say, is missing. Yeah. Yes?
I've had a couple clients and a couple friends in the last few years who are obviously into hoarding. What's an easy way or careful way or cautious way to get into their circle and try to help them without them feeling like they don't need your unsolicited advice?
They're hoarding, did you say? Uh-huh. Well, first, you have to determine, do they see it as a problem? Now, they may not. They may not. And sometimes that gets so bad, as we know, that the police come by and say, you got to clean this up. But the starting point is, and that's where in my work, we always try to determine what's the starting place here. Did you come to see me because your wife says, if you don't go, I'm going to give you a divorce? Is that the reason you're coming, or some other reason the courts have said you must come? Or are you here because you've identified a problem? So you always have to start with that. So a person who's hoarding, certainly having that discussion as a starting point about how are you feeling about the fact you can barely walk through your house with little places to walk here with everything you're hoarding, and try to draw that out. Now they may pull back and not respond to that, but unless you can open that up, you have no hope of being helpful. And I think the word you all, or the phrase we all use is that, I'd like to be helpful. I can see that you love to collect things and your house is running over with things, and I'd like to talk to you about it. Now, again, you may get told to get lost, or you may be surprised and they may start talking about it. And now, hoarders are interesting personalities. In fact, there's a TV series on, I don't know if any of you have seen it or not. It's truly amazing when you have people that behave that way, to realize that that's a symptom. So what you're after as trying to help them is, what is their anxiety? Because they're anxious about something, and they're managing their anxiety by hoarding. So, it goes to people who store food in their basements, and because they're convinced that we're all going to be bombed and they want to have enough to live 5 weeks. And so getting to that kernel that's causing that behavior is where you have to aim. And you may try that 3 or 4 times before you finally break through. But you ignore the behavior, the symptom, you go after what's the underlying issue. Maybe one more? Yes?
Is there anything that parents and grandparents do to help children develop that executive function?
Well, good question. I think that making children, you're talking about grown children, or growing, or smaller children. Well, I think it's important to, I say to teenagers, as I said earlier, the important thing for you is to help you with judgment, help you learn how to make decisions in your life. And I'm going to help you do that. I'm going to teach you how to do that and help them understand that that's a developmental issue with them, that they can't be expected to do that. Sometimes when parents get angry at kids and say, why did you do that? They don't know why. They have no idea why. It was just impulse, but there was no executive function. So I think explaining the concept to them. I'm great on giving people visions. I think it's one of the great teaching tools that we have in our lives. And I'll end on one quick vision. For me, I was in a rural high school in Kentucky, terrible in terms of standards of teaching. I was 2 months from graduation. I was second in my class. The physician's son beat me out, the country doctor's son. But I was walking down the hall thinking, boy, I'm going to get out and get a job on the farm. Now, my dad did not own a farm, so I would have simply been a farmhand. A teacher blocked me in the hallway that everybody was petrified of, and I froze. I thought I'd done something wrong. And she said, have you thought of going to college? And I said, no. And she said, you should. And she turned around and walked off. That was my vision. College was never mentioned in my home. My parents were wonderful parents, loving parents. Neither finished high school. College was just not, it was never mentioned in my high school. In fact, only one other person, the physician's son and me, went to college. I went to college. So visioning, to answer your question, helping, and you don't do that all at once. It's a gradual process of giving the young kids a vision of brain development. And again, fascinating studies on brain development. We know that we all have heard the phrase a fit of rage. I think these studies are fascinating. People that get in a fit of rage, the frontal lobe closes down. Think how scary that is. That explains why a guy's down in jail and people are saying, I can't believe he slugged somebody. He's the nicest person. He's never done anything like that. Well, something caused him to get in a rage, and they've studied the same thing with women, and the same thing holds true. So his function closes down. So helping children understand how that develops in them, and when you get really mad, son, what little functioning you have up there is going to go away, and you're going to get in trouble. Okay, thank you.